Hey guys, Krystal here, and some big news. I made it to Chicago. Eventually, I was able to get on a flight, get here yesterday afternoon, was able to make it over to the convention center and see what was going on there and all that good stuff. Got a few interviews. Before I forget, tonight, all of us, all four of us, are planning to live stream the entire DNC primetime and do, sort of like the networks do, like react in between the big speeches and do that all live this evening. So, tech gods willing, that is the plan for this evening, which should be really fun, and really excited to be actually in the studio with everybody and getting to react in real time to whatever unfolds this evening. Okay, so wanted to give you my overall reaction to day 3 of the DNC. Top line, for a variety of reasons, I think this was the worst day for the Democrats, both in terms of, I think it was the least compelling and persuasive, even though I did think Governor Tim Walz did a great job in his speech, and there were some moving moments there. A lot of the class and economic pieces that had been emphasized, especially on day 1, were largely missing from the lineup last night. You had Oprah in the mix, who was just, sort of talking standard things about the character of the individual. Bill Clinton doing his Bill Clinton thing. So that's kind of, the TLDR of my overall take. And of course, hanging over all of this is, while Democrats very want to portray this atmosphere of joy and electric energy and a dance party, meanwhile, you have our taxpayer dollars continuing to go from the Biden-Harris administration to ship bombs to blow up babies in the Gaza Strip. And the dissonance between those two things has never been more on display than it was yesterday. So you started off with Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison, who's himself Muslim American, speaking. And this was sort of telegraphed to the Uncommitted movement and others as, like, this is going to be your guy. He's gonna say that, some things that you're going to like to hear. So he gets up there and reassures everyone that, quote unquote, Kamala and Tim are listening to you. Now, I actually was able to grab an interview with Keith Ellison yesterday in the hallway. It was before I knew he had said this particular thing, but I asked him about the Uncommitted movement. I asked him about their very basic request to have a Palestinian American speaker on the stage at the DNC, and he really sort of, dodged the question, et cetera. But we'll try to play that for you this evening. But here is, in part, what Attorney General Keith Ellison had to say yesterday.
Kamala and Tim, they fight for the people, and they also listen. And when they say we need a ceasefire and an end to the loss of innocent lives in Gaza and to bring hostages home, they're listening, friends. They agree with us. There are people watching tonight, and maybe even here tonight, who aren't sure yet about Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. If you want to know where they stand on some of the most urgent issues facing our country and the world, let me assure you, Kamala and Tim hear you. They listen, they care, and everyone is included in their circle of compassion.
Everyone is included in their circle of compassion. They hear you. They're listening to you. Well, it was shortly after this speech that the Uncommitted movement got the official word that, in fact, perhaps that circle of compassion isn't as large as one may hope. So Uncommitted movement, this came out of the Biden primaries. There was an effort in states like Minnesota, Michigan, and others to vote uncommitted instead of voting for Joe Biden as a way of putting pressure on him to improve his policy and end the genocide. As a result of that movement, a number of delegates were actually elected uncommitted delegates. And so they have been organizing a pressure campaign within the DNC. Now, ultimately, of course, they want the bombs to stop. They want us to stop funding and supporting this genocide, and of course, for there to be a ceasefire and a lasting peace. But with regard to the DNC, these are all Democrats. They want to be able to support Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And their demands at the DNC were actually very, very modest. In particular, they wanted a Palestinian American to be able to speak. Now, if you're watching the DNC, they have found time for every Tom, Dick, and Harry with a D by their name across the country, the front benchers, the back benchers, the middle benchers, the rising stars, the old fading stars, everyone. Whether it's in a primetime slot or somewhere else during the day, it is a gigantic list of speakers. So the idea that you don't have time for a single Palestinian American to give voice to how they're viewing the struggle is outrageous. And again, very reasonable ask that they made here, because they didn't even say it has to be this speaker. They said, we've got a list for you. And if you don't like who's on this list, suggest someone else, or we can make a longer list. They said, we will let you vet the speech. So you're going to know in advance what they have to say so that you can make sure you're okay with it. And yet, yesterday evening, they got the official word. This is from Prem Thakur. Under the lights of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, Uncommitted movement officially announces the DNC has said no to welcoming a Palestinian voice on the stage. Uncommitted co-lead says Vice President Harris unfortunately has made the decision that the child in me, the American child in me, who was certain my own government was going to kill me, is not going to get to be heard at this convention. He goes on and says that he will sit in protest. I just intend to stay here until I get a call from the DNC telling me they won't suppress the voices of Palestinian children, that they will accept our very humble request. That sit-in has garnered a good bit of support. I know Ilhan Omar, Cori Bush, and even AOC called in, perhaps feeling badly about her comments from her speech and the backlash over that, assuring us Kamala's working ceaselessly for a ceasefire, tirelessly, day and night, et cetera, et cetera. So this has gained quite a bit of traction, but I mean, it says everything that they can't even find 5 minutes to allow Palestinians to speak for themselves, to explain, to humanize themselves. You had the family members of a hostage speak very movingly yesterday at the DNC, including a call for peace, including a call to end the violence against innocent Gaza civilians. But you can't have a single Palestinian American. Again, these are people, and there are many like them out there, not just these uncommitted delegates, who want to be filled with the joy that many at the DNC want to be filled with that spirit, want to be excited about supporting a Kamala Harris and a Tim Walz, and are just looking for some really basic indications that their humanity is fully recognized, and that, and this is the most critical part, the policy will actually change. And listen, I think it's bullshit, this idea that Kamala is bound by because she's Biden's vice president, she can't say anything, she can't create any distance. I think that's total nonsense. And I also, not only is it morally outrageous, it's politically idiotic, because one of the things she wants to do, and is very evident throughout these entire proceedings, she wants to create some distance politically between herself and Joe Biden. So here's your chance. Not to mention, there's been quite a bit of polling at this point that says achieving a ceasefire and doing what it takes to achieve a ceasefire, that only benefits you politically. So while there's been a lot of unity on display at the DNC, and of course it's not been 1968, there have been protests, but it has not been, nearly the scale that some thought would be. While there's a lot of elite unity at the top, you really risk undermining the new enthusiasm that young Americans in particular have for this ticket by, these types of, frankly, heartless and inexcusable moves. There was one clip I wanted to show you that I think sort of embodied the vibe of DNC attendees, who also, by the way, overwhelmingly want a ceasefire. I mean, we know a majority of Democratic voters say this is a genocide, but they look at the uncommitted delegates and the protest movement, et cetera, and having to be faced with these atrocities as very uncomfortable. It ruins their party. And so Breakthrough News caught this video, or took this video of DNC attendees who are leaving, and there are protesters who are calling out the names of Palestinian children who have been murdered. And they're all covering their ears. Let me play this for you.
The blood of these children is on your hands. 13 years old. Sama Abdullah.
Say it again. Say it again. Mock them again. Mock the children again. Do it again. Do it again.
18 years old. 13 years old. Yusuf Hassan. 8 years old. Turn around and join the uncommitted delegates in the protest.
So it's like physically uncomfortable for these DNC attendees to be faced with the reality of what their government and a Democratic administration is doing. And in real time, their physical expression of that is to plug their ears. They just want the party to continue and not to have anything ugly intrude on it. And what could be uglier than a genocide that our government is funding and shipping the bombs for and has not just allowed to continue, but actively enabled? What could be uglier than that? Last thing I'll show you on this, and then I'll get to a little bit of the Tim Walz speech, which I do think was, he's an extraordinarily talented politician. I think you saw that on the stage. I think he's a great asset to this ticket. I'm excited that he is the vice presidential nominee. Is much better than any of the other choices. But again, very difficult to celebrate any of that when this is the backdrop. Take a look at Muslim Women for Harris is actually disbanding. You can see here's the full statement. They say we cannot in good conscience continue Muslim Women for Harris. Walz, in light of this new information from the Uncommitted movement. The family of the Israeli hostage that was on the stage tonight has shown more empathy towards Palestinian Americans and Palestinians than our candidate or the DNC has. This is a terrible message to send to Democrats. Palestinians have the right to speak about Palestine. We pray that the DNC and VP Harris's team make the right decision before the convention is over for the sake of each of us. So there you go. A very immediate sign that this is having real consequences among a coalition that Democrats have been very excited has come back together around Harris Walz. And it's not just Muslim women. It is many young voters, maybe many parts of the Democratic coalition, and especially in key states like Michigan. And, even outside of the electoral impact, it's a horror. It's an absolute horror. Okay, so with that as the backdrop, let's go ahead and get to Governor Tim Walz. This was his big night, his big introduction on the national stage. And he gave, I think, an excellent speech, really demonstrated why they put him on the ticket because of the way he is able to communicate a very popular and populist agenda, the way he gives heft to Democratic promises that they might actually do some of these things, because it's one thing to have Kamala Harris out there who was in the administration saying that she'll do these things. It's another thing when you make the choice to put a governor on the ticket who has actually done it in his state. So he really adds heft to the ticket in that way. He also, he has a very effective way of contrasting his vision of America, and in particular, rural America, with the Trump-Vance version of America, their focus and their version of freedom versus the Walz version of freedom and the version of freedom that the Democratic Party is, trying to effectuate and push forward. So let's take a listen to a little bit of what was very effective about his presentation here. Let me pull this up.
And we made sure that every kid in our state gets breakfast and lunch every day. So while other states were banning books from their schools, we were banishing hunger from ours.
So
And
he And, you know, he went on a long riff there too about the other policies that he had passed in the state. And these are all things that, you know, the economic policies are all 70, 80% support. He has sort of single-handedly come up with the Harris campaign's framing. Number one of, rather than doing the grandiose, like, oh, Trump is this great threat to democracy, et cetera, which I'm not saying that there's not legitimacy there, given his attempts to undermine democracy. But he came up with, instead of making this guy big, just laugh at him, make him small. And it seemed to almost be instinctive to him from probably his many years of being a public school teacher and dealing with bullies and having a lot of experience with that. And so when he came up with that, yeah, these guys are just a bunch of weirdos, it really stuck. And I think appropriately, or I think it was a correct decision. There hasn't been like a ton of just harping on they're weird. But the general direction of, rather than making them into a grand threat, make Trump sort of like just pathetic and ridiculous. At this point especially, I think it is a very wise move and seems to be totally driving Donald Trump absolutely insane. So there was some of that in this message, and he really set the tone for that direction of the campaign. He's also really set the tone in terms of the type of policies that they want to pursue, and this framing of freedom that, you know, while their version of freedom is having the government in your doctor's exam room, our version is making sure kids don't go home hungry at school, making sure that moms and dads can take off time when they need to, or after a baby is born, etc. So I think he's been very effective at that in a way that has, and especially with abortion being so central, Minnesota took a lot of important steps with regard to abortion rights after the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So he has a lot of credibility there. There was one other moment I wanted to show you, which, so Tim Walz has two children, a son and a daughter. His son has ADHD and nonverbal learning disorder. And throughout Governor Walz's speech was clearly very emotional and very moved. And there was one moment in particular where Governor Walz called out his family directly, and his son jumps up and there's tears streaming down his face. And he seems to say, like, that's my dad, that's my dad. Let's take a look at that, and then I'll react to it a little bit on the other side. Here is that clip.
Hope, Gus, and Gwen, you are my entire world, and I love you. I'm letting you in.
So, you know, as a mom, seeing that, it's very moving to me. These kids clearly, like, they adored their dad. They're so excited for him. You know, his son up there, just so emotional and so happy. But of course, this was taken and turned in a very ugly direction quite quickly. Here's a Newsweek article. MAGA mocks Tim Walz's son for crying during DNC's speech. I won't give you all the details here, but you can just imagine there are a bunch of ugly posts about this beta maxing, blah, 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 that were shared a million times. And there's a lot to say. I'll save it for maybe when I'm talking to the crew this evening, but there is a lot to say about, like, the conception of family that has been really embraced and leaned into at this DNC from, you know, Doug Emhoff, who is the biggest wife guy you could ever imagine. Kyle was enjoying the Doug Emhoff wife guy moment, and Kamala Harris with her stepchildren, and you know how clearly they love her and love their dad, and even Doug's ex-wife was involved in making the video. So you've got this very, like, modern blended family on display. You have this family with Governor Walz on display, and their just joy and emotion uninhibited, etc. So you have a very inclusive conception of family. Pete Buttigieg spoke last night. He talked a little bit about this. You know, there's been a lot of talk about childless cat ladies. Oprah made a joke about childless cat ladies that I thought was one of the better parts of her speech, which overall was kind of an versus in particular, J.D. Vance conception of family, which is very cramped and very, like, here's how it's supposed to be, and that's it. And not only, if you don't meet that standard, not only are we like, we're going to shame you for it, we're going to judge you for it. That's an affirmative part of our agenda, is that we think that certain types of family are the right ones, and we think we should punish the types of families that are the wrong ones. And that's the core of the childless cat lady thing. And a lot of the thinkers that J.D. Vance models his philosophy after, you know, they would come out and say, no, it's not just that we should encourage family. We actively need to shame and scorn these, you know, not having children or these other types of quote unquote non-traditional families. So in any case, this moment with Walz's son is sort of emblematic of these different conceptions of family, different conceptions of masculinity, and what all of that means. So became a little bit, I think it became a little bit of a lightning rod in that conversation. But, you know, to me, looking at it again as a mother, I was very moved by it. I thought in a way he kind of stole the show, even as his dad gave a fantastic speech. So again, overall takeaways: Bill Clinton spoke, nothing to write home about. He's quite elderly at this point and doesn't have the same charisma that he once did. Oprah, she's effective. She's very charismatic. Like, there's no doubt about that. But in terms of actually leaning into the economic populism that I think has been really working for them, there was very little of that. You had Mayor Pete up there on stage, you had Josh Shapiro, kind of put all the like Obama knockoffs, I guess, on one night, just like condensed them all together. That was overall, I thought it was the weakest of the 3 nights so far. Will be interesting to see what all they've got for this evening. I think Pink is supposed to perform, and obviously the big speech everybody is waiting for is Kamala Harris, to see how she does under, you know, this kind of pressure with this kind of big national spotlight. So as I said before, we will all be in the studio together, live streaming tonight during prime time. We'll probably start a little bit before so we can talk through some of last night as well and preview tonight. And then we'll be reacting in between all of the speeches. So join us there for the DNC tonight, live. See you soon.